Welcome, everyone, to this CG podcast where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. And I'm honored to have Frank Armstrong to speak with today. He's the editor of Cassandra Voices, which is an Irish online public intellectual forum and news source that is a home for independent voices and that inspires new thinking. Frank is joining us from Dublin, and he's published throughout the pandemic, he's published multiple pieces in Cassandra Voices on topics like zero COVID, vaccine passports, lockdown, and the science around COVID policies, and also media censorship. So thanks so much for being on the podcast today, Frank.
Thank you for inviting me, Kevin. I'm delighted to talk to your audience.
Great. So I wanted to talk about sort of three things today. I wanted to get your sense of just how, in what ways the Irish response differed from other European countries or was unique. I wanted to talk a little bit about the COVID inquiry that is supposedly being planned or might be planned in the foreseeable future in Ireland. And then also get your opinion about how the Irish media during the pandemic, how they reported on COVID policies and sort of scientific opinion. So yeah, why don't we start with the Irish COVID response? So just thinking for people who are not familiar with how Ireland handled the pandemic, how would you summarize the experience?
Well, I suppose they're separate questions. How does a country perform? I mean, we got these league tables, didn't we, in terms of COVID cases and COVID deaths, and really a lot of the data. I'm sure your research is around untangling some of that,
Mm,
and some of the you know the ways in which deaths were decided. And that alone
mm,
I'm sure it was the subject of many of your discussions. So in terms of how we performed, I don't think there's probably much difference. It passed through like everywhere else.
mm,
Uh, I'm sure perhaps the vaccines had some effect. We don't, again, it's very difficult to tell.
mm,
Although one would assume from the way we were presented with the vaccines that they were the elixir of life, and assured
right.
us, uh, survival. Um, um, but I think the just to go back to your first question, what's different about Ireland? Well, I think there are, it's an unusual country insofar as you might say it's a sort of post-colonial society,
Mm,
um, where it's a reasonably young country,
mm,
maybe sort of struggling, to assert itself in the world, and instinctively sort of perhaps anti-English would often
mm,
be the reflex.
mm,
And so when it began, it was people were glued to the television screens like everybody else around the world, and
mm,
observing, well, what was Boris Johnson doing? And
mm,
Boris Johnson, of course, was very blasé about it, shaking hands with people in hospitals, and and I think there was a determination among the Irish people and the government that we wouldn't be like that, that we
mm,
would be blasé about it, and we would take it seriously.
more
And it's also,
assertive.
yeah, and also the the relationship with the United States is interesting because traditionally Irish people have supported the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump was a kind of hate figure, I would say, in that period, and anything Trump said was instantly, you know,
Mm,
considered completely moronic, or worse.
mm,
Um, so that, and then you have the fact that we're an island, and so, well, to an extent, well, we do share a land border with the north, but that 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 we the state is on an island, and
right.
so things could happen here in a way that is detached from the
Mm,
rest of Europe and even the
mm,
UK.
mm,
So that created circumstances in particular where this idea of zero COVID was sort of the way the opposition
mm,
took it up. That
right.
we could be like New Zealand, we could be like Australia, where they were all in sports stadiums and enjoying parties and, living happily while
Mm,
we were all locked down. So this was what the opposition, the left in particular,
mm,
sort of, grasped a hold of as the way to deal with this.
mm.
And I think the government were quite content with that because it sort of it took debate away from the impacts of lockdowns themselves or the
Right.
impacts of restrictions, which were, they were reported, but they were definitely not the contentious matters. It was a kind of was a broad consensus in a small country that this was how we should um, react.
Mm, mm,
That was how it began in any case.
mm. No, that's great. So, I mean, a couple of thoughts. One is it's interesting that so-called Trump derangement syndrome or the influence of Trump, on people actually isn't just an American phenomenon. That it actually sort of migrates to places like Ireland. I wasn't aware of that, which is interesting. Number two is I am actually not familiar with the zero COVID movement in Ireland. I followed it very closely in Scotland, where actually I used to live. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And also, I'm just wondering in terms of lockdowns, because my sense was that Ireland actually had quite a long lockdown if you compare it to other European countries, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. So dealing with COVID, the zero COVID movement. I mean, I found it quite absurd, frankly, but it really was popular. It
Okay.
was sort of like you know, just Ireland traditionally is quite a Catholic country,
Yeah.
and there's a sort of level of sanctimoniousness that you get in a Catholic country,
Mm,
and I
right.
think it tapped into that kind of culture,
Right.
and this was the sort of the zero COVID movement was a sort of holier movement than
Right.
even the mainstream.
Yeah.
Uh,
It could be
but they
pure.
had, it was like many of the spokespeople had no background in public health. One
Mm,
was a neuroscientist in
mm,
particular, a guy called Thomas Ryan, um, and he was very outspoken and articulate, scientific
right.
about how we had to adopt this crackdown on COVID,
Yeah.
treat it like a murder,
Right. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. We
any
were. Yeah.
is immediate. Any person is, taken away into some facility, and the borders are
Right.
like as if we're dealing with Ebola, basically.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, another thing about the zero COVID is they would call any effort that didn't have restrictions. You were letting the virus spread, and it was committing. Some people use the word genocide, right? Or culling, deliberate culling of the population. These sort of very drastic terms, right?
yeah, no, there was also this idea, the promised land lay ahead. That if only
Okay.
we could just go through a bit of pain, you know, we could all live like they do in New Zealand, and
Right.
we could
Okay.
have we could all dance on the crossroads and sing songs together.
Okay.
So, so it tapped into something in the country, and
Yeah.
this really, and the op like the sort of let's say the most left wing uh, parties all adopted zero COVID. The
Okay.
Trotskyites adopted it,
Okay.
the Social Democrats adopted it.
Yeah.
Uh,
So roughly what percentage of the, I mean, I'm wondering if there's any polls on this, but what percentage of the population, if you polled them, I don't know, at mid 2021 or whenever this zero COVID sort of fashion was at its peak, what percentage do you think agreed with it or thought it was a decent idea?
well, I think polling in that period was a little unreliable,
Yeah, I
and
mean, polling's always kind of unreliable, but you know.
it's all about asking the right questions. Um, I think it's difficult to tell because, especially because it was so artificial because people weren't actually talking to one another face
Mm,
to face. Everybody was being subjected to media, being propagandized
right.
from the moment they got up in the morning and looked at their phone.
Mm,
Um, uh, and so I think it's difficult to tell. I think it was maybe seen as in desperation as a possible, solution,
okay. Yeah.
uh, but like, it's Austin is like people out on the street campaigning for it. Well, how could they? Because it was zero
Right.
COVID. So they weren't
Right.
allowed to like breathe in front of each other.
Exactly. Okay. Interesting. Did you feel like did Brussels exert any influence in terms of how Ireland was thinking about these things? I mean,
Definitely.
obviously, yeah. Okay. In what ways?
Well, I mean, there's okay. So Ireland, I think the next point is about structural, economic, structural, the structure of the Irish economy, where we're very dependent on a number of large multinationals who operate in the country,
Hmm.
including Pfizer
Okay.
and other big pharma companies and the big tech. So a lot of them have their European headquarters
Right.
in Ireland because we have a very low rate of corporation tax. So that attracts these big American companies.
Hmm.
Um, and so with that, um, you know, there's a kind of vulnerability that the Europeans will take away our right to have this low corporation tax. So there's for a long time we've had this deference towards the Europeans,
Hmm.
and so COVID restrictions were as time went on. Now we weren't like the Spanish or the Italians to start with because we don't have much of a tradition of authoritarianism. We don't have a very well-oiled
Hmm.
sort of
Hmm. Hmm.
gendarmerie,
Right.
that you might find in France or in Italy maybe as
Yeah.
well. So it's a little bit more chaotic in Ireland,
Okay.
but it was more of a slow grind, and so by 2021 things were grind. The noose was kind of tightening.
Right.
It just went on and on in 2021, and as if people were, really just enjoying this power that they held.
Hmm.
Uh, this kind of a serious mission creep um,
Yeah.
came in,
Hmm.
and so the pressures that you would have found in other economies um, weren't weren't as great here. So you had the sort of traditional businesses, the hoteliers,
Hmm.
the pub owners, and so on. They could kind of be paid off, whereas the larger company, the multinationals, they were um, doing very well internationally. So
Okay.
kind of wanted to keep it. So but the Europeans, the European policy was obviously to lock down and impose vaccine mandates,
Hmm.
or at least vaccine passports. And so that kind of, we followed the script to the letter in that, we were going to be the best Europeans in the class,
Okay.
and impress everybody.
So how widespread and strict were the vaccine passes?
Well, I mean, they were reasonable. Like any pub you wanted to go into, they demanded a vaccine pass, except out
Okay.
in the country areas where things were a little bit more flexible and there's a bit more of a rebel spirit out there.
Right.
But people were getting around them. I remember meeting a guy who was going around with a cracked phone and a
Yeah.
fake QR code. And he was
Right.
saying, I go up to them and I say, oh, I just smashed my phone. I can't get in. Uh,
Mm.
you know, so he was
Mm.
getting in everywhere.
Yeah.
So people were getting around it. Uh, Things were beginning to, particularly as 2021 went along, there were like sort of illegal gatherings going on in different places, and not
Right.
that I was there, of course.
No, of course not. Right, Frank? Okay. Interesting. Interesting. All right. So let's. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of the Irish response, but now transitioning to kind of topic number two in terms of the inquiry. So I guess to sort of get us started there is obviously with a zero COVID policy, movement, that's a pretty big deal. And I'm curious about the sort of legacy of that and how that's going to be remembered. But could you just give us a sense of where Ireland is at with an evaluation or an inquiry and sort of what's taking place?
Well, I think people are just brushing it under the carpet. It's there's no will to look back on what happened because it's just embarrassing for the country,
Mm.
as far as I'm concerned. The government don't want to look at it because there were a lot of excess deaths at the start, in the nursing home sector.
Right.
Um, I think we had the second highest proportion of care home deaths in the world after Canada.
Okay.
Um, and there was grave damage done to children through the lack of education in that period.
Mm.
Um, a lot of people really, really suffered. I've been making light of it earlier, but there were, people's, people's careers were really upset, particularly freelance people,
Yeah.
um, musicians, artists, small business
Mm.
people were really hit by it.
Did you have a lot of workplace vaccine mandates? So like in the universities, or was it mostly
Um,
the passes?
no, not as much as other places. I mean, there were threats, various threats being issued, but to my knowledge, I don't think they came about. I think
Okay.
they would have been challenged.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So there's this reluctance and reticence to review the past, but there was some announcements in the last couple of months about a COVID inquiry, right?
Yeah, they keep saying, "Oh, we're going to have an inquiry," because it doesn't look great really when other countries are having COVID inquiries. There's one going along in the UK, and
It
but
can
the
it can
opposition
be it
are
can be it can be bigger and better than the English one, right?
well, you know there's no pressure from the opposition. Importantly, there's no pressure from the media. The media are themselves compromised because the media. We'll go into it, I think, in due course. But the
Yeah.
media received a lot of advertising revenue in that period, and so they're from the government, from the
Mm.
health services executive. So they weren't expressing much opposition in their
Okay.
pages. Very
Yeah.
little. They're very
Right.
scary.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
so when it comes to an inquiry now, we've just had the resignation of Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Taoiseach Varadkar, um, who was identified with the first part of the response.
Mm.
And that came straight after an election. So there was a lot of political instability. And as a result, the civil servants tended to take over control of the response. And
Okay.
actually, famously, the Minister for Health was excluded from the committee that were to run it. Um, so it was kind of the permanent government that took over,
Mm.
and the politicians were sort of left on the sideline to a large extent. Um, and so in the meantime, yes, this guy Varadkar, he he handed the reins of power over to Martin,
Okay.
uh, who was Taoiseach for 2 years, and then he got it back as part of their coalition arrangement, and
Yeah.
then he recently resigned. Um, for slightly mysterious reasons. There was a referendum on care
Mm.
in the Constitution and the place of the woman in the home, and
Yeah.
but so he basically he has become quite unpopular, and we
Mm.
have a significant housing crisis. Young people don't have access to housing.
Yeah.
And so, but there's very little talk of COVID.
Okay.
Very little.
And he was the one who was trying to set up this inquiry because it was politically beneficial for him to some degree. You were kind of sort of suggesting, and now that he's
I
out,
think,
it might.
yeah, I think there might have been some political credit he could have got out of it because he sort of knew a little bit. He was a bit cleverer. He's a
Yeah.
doctor,
Okay.
so qualified doctor. So I think he knew a little bit more about what was going on. So he was a little bit more flexible. And actually, in September 2020, he suggested that lockdowns weren't an appropriate response, and he was shot down by
Okay.
the sort of
Right.
bureaucrats, the chief medical officer, and people like that shot
Mm.
him down. And he didn't really put his head above the parapet afterwards. So
Okay.
despite sort of espousing a kind of liberal economic outlook,
Right.
he saw what side his bread was buttered on, uh,
Yeah.
and didn't really object to any lockdowns after that.
Mm-mm. Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I kind of want to ask you if you think that was a good political move on his part, because I mean, politicians are moving with the winds, but there's often unexpected opportunities when you put your head above the waterline and actually you end up being correct. So Do you think that would have been a good move for him, or is it just not possible
No,
given the atmosphere?
no. It was impossible in the atmosphere at the time. I mean, I was shocked. Like the lack of critical thinking in the country was really striking.
Okay.
I mean, maybe that's the case. I mean, everybody became a little bit despondent, or at least who I suppose
Mm,
are on our side of the argument became a bit despondent about the capacity of people to
yeah.
reason around what was happening.
Mm,
But I thought it was particularly bad in Ireland.
okay.
And maybe to go back to it, the sort of the Catholic inheritance, I think, had something to do with that.
Okay. No, that's an interesting point. So, okay, so you're not so optimistic about whether there is going to be, or about the results of a COVID inquiry, but there might not even be one in Ireland, despite the fact that there's been, I mean, a good number of media articles about this over the last couple of months, but now it's sort of there's uncertainty around it. Okay.
Yeah. So Varadkar has resigned, and the Minister for Health, the guy who was Minister for Health when it began, he has become Taoiseach, Prime Minister.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
All right.
yeah, he's a young man, um, and he he has not mentioned it at all. And
Right.
we're now due. There has to be an election within the next 8 months. So I don't see any, you know, I don't think they'll risk it basically.
Yeah.
Um, so unless they're looking to distract us from something else, and they see
Mm,
this as a way of
mm,
creating distraction, then I don't see anything happening. And because so many of the opposition
right.
were like
Right.
arguing for harsher restrictions,
Right.
they don't, I don't think they want to go
Right.
there
Right.
either.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. No, that's fair enough. We'll wait the results of the election and see, right? If there's some sort of, rebel reformer who comes out of nowhere.
Well, this is
Um,
it. I mean, there a lot of people learned, uh, you know, found out for themselves, did their own research, um, you know, encountered, people like Sunetra Gupta online,
mm,
um, and there were a number of doctors, a couple of whom we published,
yeah.
including Dr. Marcus de Bruin, who were articulating the other side
Right.
of the
Right.
argument.
Right.
Um,
And Marcus, I
and
mean, you did a piece on Marcus, I believe, and I'm trying to remember, did he suffer quite a lot of consequences with his employment as a medical doctor? And I mean, from what I remember, he was saying quite reasonable things. Is that the case?
yeah, yeah. So he's still under investigation. So he still has that hanging over him. And it's quite disturbing, really. And what he's being. I think there was some interview he gave in which he said something like, "I think my hand's going to fall off. I've shook so many hands at a protest, and they're trying to skewer him over that."
Okay.
Um, and he also, came out very much against the vaccine for his own reasons. Um, but a very very reasonable scientific response. He has a background in microbiology, so
Hmm.
he knew he could tell you exactly what was happening,
Hmm.
and understood it perfectly well. And he just held the view from the start that this was, an inappropriate drug for people to take.
Hmm.
And I think his point was that healthy people should not take this vaccine.
Yeah,
So
I seem to remember he had some sort of age cutoff or like a description around. He was more against the sort of population-wide mass vaccination.
yes, yeah, and he was skeptical about I think even for any age group. But yes, he wasn't, like he's not an anti-vaxxer. He
Yeah.
would have given out thousands of vaccines, as a general practitioner.
Hmm.
So really he had an issue with this. He was also focused on masks
Right.
as a microbiologist, he just couldn't believe what was happening, around masks.
Yeah.
And he had a, he was quite belligerent
Mm.
on Twitter. So he ruffled a few feathers, all right.
Okay.
Um, um, but and I think that they wanted to kind of silence him
Okay.
and
Should make
uh,
make him sort of an example.
yeah, and it was hard on him. I'm sure, like, everybody has their own style. Everybody has, their own way of communicating. You know, I mightn't have communicated as he did in certain instances, but
Right.
I think he was coming from the right place. I don't think he wasn't motivated by wealth.
Yeah.
Um, you know, who knows about
Mm.
ego, but like, I don't think he's not a corrupt man. He's a man of
Mm.
simple tastes and
Mm.
a kind of philosophical individual.
Mm.
Um, and it was just, yeah, it was pretty awful the way
Mm.
he was treated,
Mm. Mm.
frankly.
Interesting. Okay, so getting back to, you said a couple of things about the media in Ireland, right? Specifically about zero COVID, but did you find that there was, how would you describe the media ecosystem or climate during the pandemic in Ireland?
Okay, so Ireland's a small country. We've seen media consolidation over, the last couple of decades, in line with other countries. We've seen, journalism in decline.
Mm.
Um, so really, you have in Ireland basically two main newspapers, the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, and then you have some English titles, and you have the state broadcaster. And the main thing to be aware of is the extent to which they were all being, the advertising that was going into them in that period was coming from the government. So they were getting
Right.
a lot of money from the government, and they were, on message
Mm.
basically
Mm.
throughout. Um, you know, so you didn't get much. You got occasional windows of criticism, um, where, as if to, that they felt like they needed to get um, some balance. So there was a
Mm.
guy called Martin Feely, who was a prominent, I think he was a surgeon, and uh, he resigned at a certain point, and he caused a bit of commotion, and he wrote one or two articles and appeared on,
Okay.
on television, and
Yeah.
so, but I think that was during the period just before the vaccine arrived. So
Okay.
once the vaccine was approved, then, very little discussion,
Yeah.
we locked down until everybody is vaccinated. That
Right.
was basically the dominant narrative, and there was very little room for debate.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, it was quite scary, really. It just seemed it seemed like they really had a grip on the levers of power,
Mm.
and even up to the Christmas of 2021, before the Delta variant uh, arrived, or the Delta variant, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Um, Christmas wasn't really allowed to happen.
Okay.
Uh, and people, if anything, were getting more accustomed to these controls, and,
Mm.
and to the onset of a kind of authoritarianism.
Mm. Mm. Okay. So Frank, just to wind up our discussion here, I'm just wondering, in terms of, if there was another health emergency a couple years down the road, right? Do you think Ireland would respond in any different way, or what's your impression?
Um, yeah, good question. I think we would be. I think that there's been a lot of people. A lot of people have reconsidered how they react. I think it's very difficult to tell, because
Mm.
it's a bit of a sensitive subject. You
Okay.
know, you know, uh, like, I sometimes, I'm a little bit provocative, and might bring it up, and
Right.
and you often, there'll be a bit of silence, but more and more people are kind of, accepting. Oh well, we were a bit over the top there.
Right.
The bit about, the police kind of
Mm,
going around, kind of stopping you from going out,
mm, mm,
sitting
mm,
down
mm,
outside.
mm,
That was a bit crazy.
mm,
And,
mm,
and people are, so they're, and I think, some people I know who would have been more conformist at the start would be now saying, no, I'd never accept that again. No, no
okay.
more, no more, none of that ever again. So I don't think people would accept a lockdown. I think a lot of people would be, not only would people not accept it, but there would be opposition
Okay.
instantly if there was
Right.
any suggestion of it ever happening again, because people were quite mobilized and people are
Mm,
quite organized. And there have been kind of, unfortunate, I would say, repercussions because it has, you know, politically now there's a lot of instability.
okay.
A lot of people are voting for independent candidates.
Mm,
There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the political system,
okay.
disillusionment.
Right.
Um, so it's you know under the surface, even though we're ostensibly a very prosperous country, under the surface, I think there's a lot of discontent, and I think a
Okay.
lot of that can be traced back to the pandemic. So I
Mm,
think it would be very divisive if they in inverted commas were to try anything again.
okay. Well, interesting. Thanks so much for the fascinating conversation, Frank. That's Frank Armstrong, who's the editor at Cassandra Voices, and you should check them out online. Thanks so much, Frank.
Thanks, Kevin.